Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and I've got a great show for you today, I think. Today's presentation is called See a UFO Lose Your Job. I know of many cases where this has happened. People will see a UFO, or they'll tell someone at work that they are an abductee, or they'll express an interest in UFOs or in researching this subject, and as a result will lose their job. This is really unfortunate because people already experience sometimes considerable trauma when they have a UFO encounter, and then they have to go through the additional trauma of being disbelieved or ridiculed. So that's why I wanted to do this video. I've got about a dozen cases I want to share with you today. And the first case I want to talk about, real briefly actually, is the Travis Walton case. I don't want to get too into it because it's already pretty well known, I think. But for those who don't know, on November 5, 1975, Travis Walton and 6 other woodcutters were out in the Sitgreaves National Forest. This is in Arizona, when they experienced a UFO encounter. They all saw this object at treetop level. Travis got out of the truck and walked under this object and was struck by a beam of light and was actually pulled on board this craft. Again, the case is very well known. What's important here is that Travis was missing for 5 days, at which point there was a lot of accusations that the other men had actually murdered him and were covering it up. Thankfully, Travis was returned, and accusations continued that perhaps the men had concocted some sort of hoax to get out of their logging contract, which is not true. What is true is that they lost their job over this whole UFO incident. Their superior was a man by the name of Junior Wilson, and Junior Wilson makes it clear that, yeah, he had to let them go because the contract was not being fulfilled. Problem wasn't that they were being fired, it was because they refused to go to work up in this area. As Junior Wilson says of Michael Rogers, who was the superior of, the boss of Travis Walton and the others, as Junior Wilson says, and I quote, "He," meaning Michael Rogers, "had no reason to hoax. I didn't see that he had anything to gain as far as his contract was concerned, to conjure up a story of this kind. He did lose the contract later on because he couldn't get men to go back and work for him in that area. We did re-advertise the contract and resell it to another person." So the point is here, they lost their jobs over this entire UFO sighting. And this is not uncommon. This is what happened to a certified public accountant by the name of Leah Haley from Pensacola, Florida. She was a lifelong experiencer and had a lot of strange experiences throughout her life, but after 2 pretty intense missing time experiences, she finally sought help, and she found a hypnotherapist by the name of John Carpenter, who is a UFO researcher, and using regressive hypnosis, she recalled that she had been taken on board a UFO and physically examined. It's a pretty long and involved case, which I won't get too into here, other than to say that Leah Haley's job suffered as a result of people at work finding out about her encounters. At that time, she worked as a certified public accountant. And mind you, Leah Haley was married, had 2 children, and had 2 master's degrees. She had 1 master's in elementary education from Alabama State University, and she had another master's degree in secondary education from Tennessee University. So a really good witness. Despite this, she received a lot of ridicule from her coworkers and her superiors at her place of employment. It just got worse and worse till they started to accuse her of being outright crazy, and she was forced to resign her position. So this is very unfortunate and happens in case after case. Just look at what happened to police officer Alan Godfrey. Alan Godfrey was a police officer in West Yorkshire, at the West Yorkshire Metropolitan Police Department in England. And he was actually twice awarded for his investigative work at the police department. So he was very well respected in his profession, married, had 2 children, an upstanding member of the community. But that all changed on November 29th, 1980, when he saw a UFO. He was actually on duty in his police cruiser. It was raining hard, and he came upon a UFO ahead of him on the highway. He whipped out his police sketch pad and actually drew this thing and reported it to his superiors. He returned to the scene with other police officers, and they saw that the road, the highway where this object had hovered, was completely dry. So there was physical evidence of his encounter. Furthermore, other calls came in reporting UFOs on that night in the surrounding area. Despite this, his fellow officers kind of started ribbing and ridiculing him. And it just got worse and worse. And when more calls came in reporting UFOs, the publicity ramped up about Alan Godfrey's sighting, and his superiors were not happy. And they eventually called Alan Godfrey into their office and said it would be best if Alan Godfrey would just resign. Alan Godfrey refused, and as a result, they punished him by taking away his police car and putting him on bicycle duty. This is really insulting, and as a result, Alan Godfrey just couldn't take it anymore. The ridicule had gotten too bad in this kind of treatment. He had lost everything he loved about being a police officer, so he just resigned. So sometimes people are actually forced into being resigned. Sometimes people are just forced into resigning. And definitely people's careers do suffer, particularly in the police force. Just look at what happened to Officer Manuel Amparano. He's a police officer from the city of Kerman, California, who on May 13, 1978, saw a UFO hovering at very low altitude. It was a solid object. It had lights on it. He shined his flashlight at it, at which point it flashed him back with white and blue lights. He initially kept his sightings a secret, didn't tell anybody. However, when he returned to the station, his fellow officers wanted to know what was wrong with his face, and it looked like it had been burned. The officer looked in the mirror and saw that his face was bright red. By the next day, blisters were forming, so he had to seek medical treatment, and as a result, received a lot of ridicule from other fellow officers and also from his superiors. And as a result, his career suffered. As he says, and I quote, "There's no question I was passed over for a promotion because of it. As an officer, I can go out, see somebody, shoot someone, write a report, and then send them to prison. But something like this happens, and all of a sudden I'm a nut." So as you can see, he's not happy, and I don't blame him. The police officers do suffer a lot from this. Another really tragic case is what occurred in Portage County, Ohio. This was on April 17, 1966. 2 police officers by the name of Dale Spar and Wilbur Neff were driving along U.S. Highway 224. This is just outside of the town of Atwater, Ohio, and they saw a UFO. It appeared to be a solid object with a dome on top rise up from behind some trees. I do have an interview a little audio clip that I'd like to play for you, in which Officer Dale Spore talks about what he saw when this object rose up from behind the trees.
My name is Dale F. Spore. I'm a deputy sheriff of Portage County, Ravenna, Ohio. Day of April, 1966, at 5:07 a.m. The locality of observation was at State Route 224, east of State Route 44.
4 miles ahead of today.
4 miles?
Yes.
And west of 183. I observed this vehicle for approximately 85 minutes. The weather conditions was clear. It was at dawn in the morning.
Was visibility good?
Visibility was very good against the
No fog or
sky.
anything like that?
We had no fog pockets, no problems with visibility at all. I observed this vehicle come up from a wooded area at a very low altitude. It was just clearing the treetops at this time. I observed it coming up very bright. It was a very bright object. It was larger than anything I had anticipated ever seeing in the air in this condition or anything. It traveled very slowly. There was only a faint hum in the area. There was no noise, no traffic on the highway beside us, either to the right or north or south of us. There was no disturbances in the neighborhood, just this humming noise. I was making a visual observation of the area after stopping to check a car I thought to be abandoned. I told my partner or my rider at this time, Grover Neff, that I asked him if he would look over his shoulder to see if he could see this thing. At this time it was still moving very slowly, coming up. He saw it very clearly, the object or vehicle or whatever you might want to call it, craft or etc., came just up the south side of the highway in an easterly direction. It came to a pause or a momentarily stop. It then came directly north, right over the two vehicles together, the abandoned car and my police car. It hovered. It was so bright I could say that it was very close to us, from 50 to not more than 100 feet above us. My first thoughts, I was very scared. I didn't know exactly what was happening. I didn't know what to expect. I had the only feeling was to get something between me and whatever this thing was. The only thing for me to go to or towards was the cruiser, which when I started, Barney went the other way. We got in the car. I sat there for a minute. I don't know exactly how long until it didn't seem to want to hurt us. I tried the radio. It did not malfunction. The carrier tripped very well. I informed the station that this object that had been sighted was directly over us. I did not try to fill them in or what was happening until I could make sure that my imagination hadn't exploded. At this time, after advising them of this object, I gave the message to the dispatcher. The vehicle moved just to the north side of the road. It paused or hesitated momentarily. It then crossed back over the road almost in the identical spot.
Over the two vehicles.
Right. And then you could hear this one humming noise. It did change. The pitch of it, I don't know how to explain it. It did change tones, as though it might have gone into a slight higher pitch. If you had one of these music things, like when I was in school a long time ago.
Pitch pipe.
Right. Mm-hmm. I forgot the name of it. It increased its altitude and moved eastward in an easterly direction at about the same time. It moved about 300 feet just east of us. It hesitated. At this time, Sergeant Schoenfeld came on the radio, wanted to know if we were still observing this object. I informed him that we were watching it. He wanted to know if we had a camera. I told him no. He says that we should try to observe the vehicle, try to pursue it or stay with it as long as possible, keep it under surveillance, report any findings that we found, anything that we might identify to prove or disprove it, to see if it was a balloon, until he could get some units in the area, a photographer or another unit with photographic equipment, or a hold of one of the police departments that this thing might be traveling towards. We started out behind the vehicle. It made no attempt to leave us immediately or anything. We went due east on 224. We had to make a south turn on 183 for a distance to pick up 224 again. When making the south turn, the vehicle was directly to our rear window. We went to 224 and 183 again. We turned left, which would put us in an easterly direction. The vehicle was to our left. It was immediately to our left, as though this thing had hesitated again. I couldn't say that it actually stopped and waited to see where we were going.
You were driving, weren't you?
But I had a handful of car. The vehicle, or this object, or whatever it was, at this time started at easterly direction again. It was very clear. It seemed to maintain the course for approximately 3/4 to a mile. It then came due south.
You mean it moved off the east direction and went south?
Came south over top of 224, remained on the south side of 224 to just about the Berlin Reservoir. At this time, it was traveling at 83 miles an hour.
So after this object rose up, it goes down the highway. It goes all the way down Highway 224, and they follow it. At points, it would move very quickly, and they chased it at upwards of 100 miles per hour. And when it started to get too far away, it seemed to slow down almost as if to wait for them. Another thing they found very peculiar was the way the UFOs seemed to always fly over the roads so that they could follow them, almost as if it was baiting them and edging them on. So they are not the only police officers who saw it. Police officers actually from 6 other stations throughout Ohio and Pennsylvania saw it as well. Officer Wayne Houston heard them talking on the radio and was actually able to park along the highway and wait for this object and saw it move overhead, and he joined the chase. Another officer, Gerald Buckert, was able to actually photograph this object. So this is very well attested to, very well documented. These 2 police officers, Dale Spohr and Wilbur Neff, chased this object for over an hour, for over a distance of some 60 to 80 miles, moving from the town of Atwater, outside of Atwater, Ohio, down Highway 224, down Highway 14, across to Highway 51, all the way to Conway, Pennsylvania. So, I mean, they chased this thing all the way until they ran out of gas. So this is, again, a very well-attested sighting. Despite this, they received an incredible amount of ridicule and ribbing in the press, and the pressure on them became just way too much, particularly for Dale Spohr. After 3 months had passed, his life was turned completely upside down. As he says, "My entire life came crashing down around my shoulders. My wife, my home, my children, all seemed to fade away." And in fact, by July of 1966, 3 months after this incident, Spohr was separated from his wife. He lost his job, he resigned, and he moved to another town. He lived in a little hotel room and made a very meager living as a painter, and was very bitter about what had happened to him. As he says, and I quote, "If I could change all that I have done in my life, I would change just one thing, and that would be the night we chased that damn thing, that saucer." And he's not the only police officer who suffered because of that particular incident. Patrolman Wayne Houston, who also joined in the chase, also regrets going public and being involved in this incident. As only a few months after the encounter, he resigned. As he says, "I quit because of that thing. There was pressure. You couldn't put your finger on it, but it was there. For one thing, the city officials did not like their police officers chasing flying saucers." The whole incident was in fact investigated by officers from Project Blue Book. J. Allen Hynek found the officers very convincing. However, the head of Project Blue Book, Hector Quintanilla, came in already skeptical and called it a mirage, talked to the witnesses for only a few minutes, and labeled the case as a satellite and Venus. He says that the officers were chasing nothing more than a satellite way high up in the sky, and of course that doesn't account for it, so we also included Venus. It's pretty ridiculous and really unfortunate that police officers have to go through this. And there are so many cases like it. Another really tragic case involving a police officer is that of Police Chief Jeff Greenhaw. He is from Falkville, Alabama, and on October 17, 1973, he was the chief of police when he received a phone call from a resident of Falkville saying that a UFO had landed near her home. And so he went out to investigate. He brought his Polaroid camera, and he didn't see any UFO. However, as he's researching the area and driving around, he came upon a metallic-suited figure. It looked essentially humanoid, but had this metallic suit that was very bright and crinkly, kind of like tinfoil, but wasn't tinfoil, he said. And he quickly grabs his camera and is able to snap 4 photographs of this thing before it starts moving away. And he said it moved in very large, loping strides. And it looked like, it had a metallic suit on. As he says, it looked like his head and his neck were kind of made together. He was real bright, something like rubbing mercury on nickel, but just as smooth as glass. Different angles gave different lighting. I don't believe it was aluminum foil. He ran in a bizarre way. He seemed to have springs in his feet for propulsion and could cover about 3 meters in every step. He was running faster than any human I ever saw. So the encounter was televised, as were the photographs, and as a result, Jeff Greenhaw's entire life went into a tailspin. What first happened is he started receiving phone threats. Following that, his car engine mysteriously exploded. He believes there may have been foul play. His wife couldn't take the pressure, and she divorced him. Following that, his house was burned down, allegedly by an arsonist. And to put the final straw, the final nail in the coffin, the local town council fired him from his position as police chief. So it basically ruined his life. As Jeff Greenhaw says, and I'm quoting, "Now I've lost my car, my wife, my job, and my home." So clearly this is a real problem in the UFO field. And here's another really tragic case. This was actually the case that got me involved in UFO research. It occurred on November 17, 1986, and the main witness is Captain Kenju Toroshi. Captain Toroshi was flying over Alaska with his crew in a commercial airliner when they encountered 2 very large walnut-shaped UFOs. It appeared on their onboard radar. It also appeared at the FAA's ground radar, which they later denied and called it split images. Researchers now know that that's not true. It was caught on radar. They've talked to the people who are actually involved in the incident in terms of the radar returns. So we know it's a great case. Captain Kenju Chiroshi actually requested a course change to try to avoid this UFO. The course change was granted, but the UFO still followed them for many miles over a period of about an hour and finally just took off. So in this case, Captain Chiroshi had no choice but to talk about the encounter because he had already officially reported it to the FAA, and Captain Chiroshi granted press interviews and talked about it to the public, and it became front page news. I remember it vividly. But as a result, Captain Chiroshi lost his job. He was grounded from flight duty by JAL Airlines, and he was put on a government desk job. And that's where he remained for many years. It's my understanding that he was later able to get back to flying, but there's no doubt that his having gone public hurt his career and that he was grounded because of it. Most pilots have learned not to talk about UFOs, as we'll find out. But it's not just being a UFO witness that can get you fired. Just if you express an interest in UFOs or UFO research, that alone can get you fired. Just look at what happened to Dr. S. Scott Corder, MD, from Ottawa, Kansas. Dr. Corder began investigating UFOs, and particularly the case of Donna Butts, a contactee from Russell, Kansas. They actually together would write a book about her case entitled The Four. At any rate, when the Kansas Board of Healing Arts found out that one of their own doctors was involved in UFO research and believed in UFOs, they began to pressure him to resign. He refused. They had no way to actually fire him, so they requested that he take a psychological evaluation. Dr. Corder refused and said that they had no legal grounds to force him to do so. And that was true, but they continued to request that he take a psychological evaluation. Dr. Corder continued to refuse, and finally, on March 13th, 1989, the Kansas Board of Healing Arts revoked Dr. Scott Corder's medical license on the grounds that he was mentally ill. So Dr. Corder now realized that he had to fight back if he wanted to keep his job, and that's what he did. He immediately went public with his case, and in 1990, just a few months later, he filed a civil suit and sued for damages in the amount of $669,000. To help his case, he did agree to undergo a psychological evaluation, and he was found actually to be of sound mind. He was not insane. He was totally sane and of normal mental competence. So as a result of this test, the Kansas Board of Healing Arts had no choice but to reverse their position. And in April of 1992, the Kansas Board of Healing Arts reinstated Dr. Corder's medical license. Dr. Corder, of course, had sued for damages, and as the result of his case, he received a judgment in June of 1993, and the judge was Frank Thies. And Frank Thies ruled that the law exempts state officials from any liability. But in a very detailed 79-page document, Judge Thies wrote, in part, and I'm quoting, "If anything is certain, clearly and undeniably from the evidence, Dr. Corder was damaged from his encounter with his licensing body, the Kansas Board of Healing Arts, with little if any fault on his part, but a profound naivete of the power of government over his person and his profession." So once again, we have a very clear warning to be very careful going public with your UFO encounter or even an interest in UFOs. Just look at what happened to City Councilwoman Frances Barwood. In March of 1997, Frances Barwood was a city councilwoman in Phoenix, Arizona, and this is when the very famous Phoenix Lights incident occurred. I won't get into it because it's a very well-known incident, and Frances Barwood herself didn't even see it, but a few months after the encounter, she was approached by the media, who begged for an interview, which she granted, and the media wanted her to investigate the Phoenix Lights incident. And she asked what it was, and they told her about this sighting, and told her that they could not get any officials from any level of government within municipal government or federal government to talk about it. She was the only one who would even talk to them. So she agreed to investigate, and she actually asked her fellow council members to draft a resolution to inquire federally about this at the office of Senator McCain, and they refused. Barwood found herself in the middle of a firestorm. She started receiving floods of calls from people reporting UFOs. She became a magnet for all the UFO reports and literally got hundreds of calls. As she says, there were 37 the first day. After that, it climbed into the hundreds. I got calls from doctors, lawyers, celebrities. A Little League coach called to say both teams and their family had seen this. Most wanted their names kept out of it, but they wanted answers. Heck, if I had seen it, I'd want answers too. She eventually did contact the office of the Governor Fife Symington, who denied any knowledge of the incident, which we now know is not true. He was lying. He actually saw the Phoenix Lights himself. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, he lied to Frances Barwood. She also contacted Senator McCain, who was unable to get any information on this subject. So she was basically stonewalled at every angle when she tried to investigate this officially. And she wondered if there was perhaps a cover-up. And she voiced this publicly, and that's when her career really began to suffer. As she says, and I'm quoting, "It was about this time that some very peculiar things regarding the lights and the government's reports concerning them became obvious, and that I was cast as a total flake. The reports that bothered me the most and probably solidified my resolve to get to the bottom of this were the contradictory reports offered by the Phoenix Police Department." So yeah, this is very unfortunate that she was forced to grab the bull by the horns and no one else would. And as a result, her career suffered. She was not reelected back as a city councilwoman. She tried to get back into Arizona politics and later ran for Arizona Secretary of State. Unfortunately, the media, which had ridiculed her in the past, continued to sort of ridicule her and called her the UFO candidate. And as a result of this, probably this UFO connection, she did not win the seat. She lost the election. So I think politicians have learned long ago that UFOs are a real hot potato and they stay away from it as best as they can. But this can definitely hurt your profession. Just look at what happened to Officer Chuck Zukowski. Chuck Zukowski had been interested in UFOs and the paranormal and Bigfoot and all these things his whole life and had never made a secret of this, and for many years had been employed at the El Paso County Police Department in Colorado. However, in 2010, things started to go south when he investigated an animal mutilation case. And Chuck Zukowski had become a pretty well-known investigator and granted a media interview. He had done this investigation into this animal mutilation as a private citizen, which he made very clear. However, in the media reports, they also let the people know that Chuck was a reserve police officer. And this is when the trouble began, because Chuck Zukowski's superiors disagreed with Chuck's position on this animal mutilation. Chuck believed it was a genuine animal mutilation, and they did not. So for this reason, and because he was investigating UFOs, they terminated his position. And they made no secret about it. They said in his termination letter, and I quote, "The termination is a result of you conducting paranormal and UFO investigation and animal mutilations." Whatever the case, it cost Chuck his job. Thankfully, Chuck was able to become a very prominent UFO investigator and actually had his own television series. It was called Alien Highway. I had the honor of being on one of the episodes, and I met him personally and spoke with him. And I know him to be a very nice and definitely a competent person. So it's unfortunate that people's careers are suffering because of even investigating UFOs. One very tragic case just like this is that of John Mack, MD. John Mack is, of course, very well known for writing the book Abduction, which came out in 1993. John Mack is the first person with a Pulitzer Prize to actually write a book on UFOs. He's also a tenured professor of psychology at Harvard Medical School, or was at the time. He's now passed away, unfortunately. But he studied some 200 abduction cases over a number of years and wrote about them in his book, Abduction. And it was shortly after publication that he started to be investigated by the dean of the medical school at Harvard. What happened was the dean of Harvard Medical School, Daniel C. Tosteson, actually appointed a committee of Mack's peers to, quote, confidentially review John Mack's interests and investigations into UFOs. This was something that had never happened before to a Harvard professor. And John Mack himself found out about this investigation through the grapevine and called it Kafkaesque. He actually did not take this sitting down. He fought back. He hired an attorney by the name of Daniel Sheehan, who was actually pretty well known in the UFO field. And Daniel Sheehan was actually able to obtain the report on John Mack, which was criticizing John Mack. And it was really interesting what the dean of Harvard wrote and this about John Mack. As the dean says, or as this committee, this report says, and I'm quoting, "It is professionally irresponsible for any academic, scholar, or practicing psychiatrist to give any credence whatsoever to any personal report of a direct personal contact between a human being and an extraterrestrial being until after the person has been subjected to every possible available battery of standard psychological test which might conceivably explain the report as the product of some known form of clinical psychosis. To communicate in any way whatsoever to a person who has reported a close encounter with an extraterrestrial life form that this experience might well have been real is professionally irresponsible." So yeah, that's quite a mouthful. Once this thing became public, other professors within the academic community at Harvard really began to question the validity of this investigation, and it wasn't long after that it was shut down. John Mack was investigated for about 1 year and 2 months, and following the investigation, John Mack was censured for, quote, methodological errors, which I'm not sure what that even means. I guess they didn't like the way he was researching, not so much what he was researching. So it looks like they're doing a little bit of backpedaling in this situation. Important here is that John Mack was not fired and was able to keep his position as a tenured professor at Harvard College. So this kind of prejudice is nothing new to Dr. John Mack. He had come across it many times with his own clients, and now he had experienced it himself. And as John Mack writes, and I quote, I found that the higher or the greater the stake that a person has in this society, in their position or their job, the more reluctant they are to admit that they've had abduction experiences. When abductees went on television with me during the spring of 1994 during my book tours and wanted to communicate and educate about it, a number of them received threats to their jobs. Some of them lost them. We have one man in a management consultation. He lost an important contract. A woman that worked for the federal government who was an abductee, she was threatened with loss of her jobs. In other words, this is not something that is regarded as acceptable. I've interviewed airline pilots who have had sightings, close-up sightings of UFOs. They will not report it because they will be removed from their work. Even if they've had abduction experiences, they will not talk about it. And 25 to 30% of airline pilots, according to a survey that one of the people I've talked with did, have had close-up sightings but will not discuss it. This simply is something that is not accepted as okay to talk about. But that may be changing. I recently saw a Harvard divinity student and I asked him this question. I said, "Do you talk about this among your fellow students?" And he said, "Oh, yes." And it turned out several of them have also had abduction experiences, and even the ones that had not were fascinated, interested, and didn't ridicule them. So maybe the climate is changing. Another researcher who's looked into this is Kevin Randall. He's pretty well known in the UFO field, certainly, and he was contacted by a professional who had UFO contact while on the job, and this had happened on many occasions, but he never told his superiors. As he told Kevin Randall, well, here's Kevin Randall, and I'm quoting, "He was sure that if he reported them, his superiors would deem him unworthy of his position, or more to the point, that he was crazy because, as we all know, only crazy people or drunks see UFOs. I suggested that very few people had ever lost a job because they had reported UFOs." Well, as we know, that's perhaps not true. As we've seen, a number of people have lost their jobs because of reporting UFOs. And in fact, Kevin Randall admits that people's careers have in fact suffered. As he writes in his article, UFO Sightings and Job Security, and I'm quoting, "I know stories of Air Force pilots who reported UFOs and have been taken off flight status. I knew of one case where an Air Force Reserve officer had not only reported a landed UFO, but also had seen a member of the flight crew, that is, an alien, and while he didn't lose his reserve position because of it, the Air Force worked very hard to smear him." So, yeah, people's careers are suffering, as we can see. Kevin Randall reports that his own career hasn't suffered, and in fact has flourished, and he's gotten several high-level security clearances despite being a UFO researcher. As he says, and I quote, "I have always thought that my relatively high profile in the UFO community would make me a target for some sort of repercussions, but it didn't." And I think that's true in a lot of cases. I mean, I myself have never suffered any repercussions. All my bosses, and I've had a number of them, have been fine with my research into UFOs. But then again, I'm just a lowly bookkeeper. I'm not a pilot for a major airliner or a professor at Harvard. So I think perhaps that is a factor, what kind of job you have. At any rate, I did do a study of these cases. I collected a bunch of them for my book, Not From Here, Volume 3. And I talk about all of these cases in that book and this unfortunate consequence of losing your job as the result of a UFO encounter. And that's really the main reason why I wanted to do this video, because this is tragic and we need to make sure that this stops happening. I do think that people who have a higher level position certainly have a lot more to lose as the result of going public, and probably are at greater risk as well for people questioning their mental competence. But this is definitely a problem within the UFO field and something people should be aware of before they start telling others about their UFO encounter, or if they think they're an abductee, or if they're even interested in UFOs. And another reason I really wanted to do this video and research this particular topic was because of what's happening with police officers and pilots and security personnel and people whose job it is to be a trained observer and look out for anything unusual. It's their job to look for anything like this, and yet they're not allowed to report it. That makes no sense at all. And because of that, I think any numbers we have of the actual number of UFO sightings is probably vastly underestimated. I am sure a lot more people are seeing UFOs than go public because they are afraid of ridicule, of disbelief, and of losing their jobs. And as we've seen, this does actually happen. So that's why I wanted to do this video today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Once again, thanks for listening, and keep having a good time and keep having fun.